Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Toppa. I'm here to talk to you about Agile contracts for software consultants. I'll start by telling you a little bit about me. This is from my childhood copy of Dr. Seuss's My Book About Me. When I was 7, I thought I wanted to be a policeman. I'm not a policeman. I've been developing web applications since the days of HTML 1.0, when web pages were first painted on cave walls. And over the years, I've worked at Ask Jeeves, E-Trade, Stanford, Georgetown, Penn, the Philly startup ElectNext, and currently I'm at PromptWorks, which is a consulting shop here in Philadelphia. Most of my work over the years has been as a developer, but I've also done a good deal of project management and team management, and I'm a big believer in Agile and lean practices. So that's a little about me. About you, an assumption I kind of had to make with this talk is that you already understand Agile practices and why they're good and why they're helpful working with your clients, because I just have enough ground to cover with the contracting side that I can't go into the basics of Agile. So that's an assumption that's in this talk. So I won't be explaining sprints, stand-ups, and so forth. I'm assuming you know what those things are already. Tell you a little bit about PromptWorks, which is where I am now. We're a small consulting shop here in Philadelphia. We do a lot of work in Ruby, Rails, Python, JavaScript, and infrastructure automation. And for clients that we work with where they'll have to maintain the code after we build it, we believe in working closely with them, pair programming with them when possible, so that when we leave, they can continue on the path using test-driven development and good object-oriented design. We are also hiring, and we're sponsors of Philly ETE. We have a booth out in the lobby if you want to talk to us. All right, so first let me start with a disclaimer. I'm not your lawyer. In fact, I am not a lawyer at all. Nothing you take from this presentation should be considered legal advice, and consult your own experts. So this is pretty much from a business practice point of view. When you're getting into signed legal documents, you should be consulting with a lawyer, not with me. So before we dive into contracts, I want to talk a little bit about professionalism. If you're familiar with Bob Martin, this is a favorite topic of his, and he tends to get at more from the angle of, when you're put in a situation where you're asked to do, too much in the time that's available, that you have the honesty, the integrity, and the courage to say no. So that's a really important point. I'm going to get at from kind of a different angle and try to put it in a little bit of a broader context. Specifically, what I want to talk about is what it means to have a professional relationship with your client if you're a contractor. This relationship is crucial to how you approach negotiating a contract and how you work with your client once that project is underway. And like many concepts that are in Lean, like Kaizen and Kanban, we can learn from the Japanese about this. I've been fortunate enough to spend a good deal of time in Japan because of my wife's work. We lived there for 6 months last year, another 6-month period back in 2007, and I've been there about half a dozen times. So I'm pretty familiar with Japanese culture. And one thing you'll find if you visit is the consistent level of politeness, kindness, and excellent service you'll receive pretty much anywhere you go. There's a columnist on Forbes that I thought put it quite nicely. She said, "Wherever I ventured, in stores large and small, I experienced what would be considered white-glove service back home, delivered with the kind of warmth, enthusiasm, and salesmanship typically found in black and white movies." More succinct way to put it, this is from the CEO of Uniqlo, which is a Japanese clothing retailer. He said there is customer service, and then there is Japanese customer service. To give you an idea of what this means, when Uniqlo opened their first store outside of Japan, in Melbourne, Australia, they spent a full year training the Australian staff to get them to a Japanese level of quality service. So imagine someone working at Banana Republic or Gap going through a year of training before they could work on the floor. This is the kind of standards we're talking about. So to give you an idea, if you ever go to Japan, something I recommend doing is going to a department store when it first opens in the morning. There's nobody there. You can walk in and start walking through the different departments, and there'll be somebody stationed pretty much every 20 or 30 feet in different sections of the store as you go along. And as you walk along, they'll be standing along the aisle, and they will bow to you as you walk by. It's sort of like the waves parting before you as you walk through. It's kind of amazing. If you have a retail experience where anything even goes slightly wrong, the people helping you will be profusely apologetic and work to address the situation as quickly as possible. And if you're in a, sort of a high-end store or restaurant, or even like getting your hair cut, when you leave, if you bought something, the person who helped you will follow you out the door and bow very deeply, like this, and they will stay bowed until you're at the end of the block. So tremendous respect for the customers. In addition to this professionalism, there's also a real friendliness. Foreigners tend not to see this so much in Tokyo, but if you venture outside, you'll see it more in other parts of Japan. A friend of ours who visited, she put it quite well. She just said, "I just wanted to hug everyone." And if you make an effort to engage socially, you may be surprised at the warmth of the interactions you'll have. And as you go around and you see people working, you'll find it's typical to see a Japanese worker perform the lowliest job as if it were the best in the world. Favorite example for me is cashiers. Maybe not like a 7-Eleven, but in maybe a nice bakery or a retail shop. You pay for something, they give you change. First they give you your coins, wait for you to put your coins away. And then when they bring out the bills, they'll maybe snap them or fan them out, sort of feel like you're at Vegas, just getting your change from the cashier. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And there's a lot of reasons why things are like this that are kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but just to give you an idea why people take so much pride in their work there. One reason is they're treated with respect by everyone. Another reason is they're paid a living wage. And the culture also emphasizes the interests of the collective group over individual interests. So based on everything I just told you, you've probably come away with the impression that in Japan, the customer is king. Because as a Westerner, you'll go there and you'll perceive this as sort of a selfless devotion to the customer, that the Japanese workers will do anything to please you, since you're made to feel so well taken care of. But that's not actually what's really going on, because we're looking at it from the perspective of sort of Western cultural assumptions that we have, where we presume this sort of hierarchical relationship. If you look at the Latin root of the words in English for service and servant, the Latin word is servus. In Latin, it's also the same word as slave. There's no distinction there. So that's sort of the sort of cultural baggage that we take with us when we think about service. Japanese concept of service has a different cultural context. There's a Japanese word for it, of course. It's called omotenashi. It has two different literal translations. One is single-hearted, and the other translation is achieve. It's the combination of these meanings that defines the Japanese concepts of service and hospitality. It's about anticipating your customers' needs and proactively meeting them. So in this relationship, you and your customer each have a role to play, and you're equals. The devotion that the Japanese have is really to consistent excellence, not necessarily to a particular customer. Sort of a subtle distinction, but it's interesting. So as a customer, in Japan, you're never expected to tip a waiter, taxi driver, or anyone else. If you think about it, a tip is sort of like, you're giving your blessing, like you've done a good job. That the person's sense of accomplishment is based on your satisfaction. And it's a little different than that. It's really their sense of job satisfaction comes from their sense of professionalism. It's quite interesting. Even as a customer, you're not expected to say thank you. I had a Japanese tutor, and I was asking her, like, do I say thank you in the present tense or the past tense? Because it's a little different in Japanese with the verb tenses. And she looked at me sort of confused. She's like, you're the customer. You don't have to say anything. But as a customer, you are expected to respect the professional judgment of your service provider and respect their expertise. So if you're in a situation, you're a Japanese service provider, and your customer is pressing you for something or giving you a hard time, it means something's gone really wrong. It could mean, quite possibly, you haven't done your job correctly. But it could also mean that the customer has overstepped the bounds of their roles. Maybe they don't realize it or don't fully understand the ramifications of what they're asking for. So I was a little hesitant putting this slide up because it sounds kind of pejorative. But what I really mean by saying, in Japan, the customer is incompetent but is made to feel like a king. What I mean by incompetent is that they are not competent to perform or fully understand the service provider's role. They're competent in their role as a customer. So it's an important distinction. So as a service provider, if you run into this situation, for the sake of your customer actually having a good experience and for the sake of your reputation, you have a responsibility to not be pushed into behaving unprofessionally. In this kind of situation, a Japanese service provider will still be incredibly polite, will patiently try to educate you, or maybe evasive. I'm not recommending you be evasive. That's more of a Japanese cultural thing that doesn't work here in the US. But they will resist doing the wrong thing with steely resolve. So to give you some examples of what I'm talking about, I had a favorite store that I would go to for pastries and other foods. And they would always put every little thing in a separate bag, which drove me nuts. It felt very wasteful to me. The Japanese also understand that it's wasteful, but that is trumped by their concern about something possibly going wrong with your food as you take it home. So I might say, put all my breads in the same bag. I don't care. I'm a foreigner, they can easily ignore what I'm saying, maybe pretend they don't understand me. And because they're thinking, if I put the sugar donut in the same bag as the egg bread, there's going to get sugar on the egg bread. He's going to be unhappy when he gets home, and he's going to say, we did something wrong, even though he told me to put it in the same bag. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Another example, this is an experience my wife had. She bought a present for someone at a store, and they asked, is this a gift? And she said yes. But then, of course, once you tell them it's a gift, it has to be gift wrapped. It has to look beautiful. And my wife being sort of coming at it from an American perspective, like, oh, don't worry about it. It's not important. Just give it to them. Like, no. We have to do this properly, because they're thinking this gift not only represents you as the gift giver, it also represents us as the retailer giving this gift. And we want to make sure this is done well, so everyone is happy in the end. So where am I going with all this? I'm going to start translating this into relationships with clients here. So to give you an example from sort of the web application development world, I used to be manager of a web team at the School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And the admissions office came to us and they said, we want a blog. So one response we could have given was say, okay, do you want people to be able to comment, start going through detailed requirements? Well, that's not what we did. Instead, we stepped back and we asked the question, why? What do you want to do with the blog? What are your goals? What are your business goals? Since this is not a sort of profit-seeking enterprise, it wasn't like a return on investment calculation you could do, but it was getting at what are their goals with their applicants that they're trying to achieve when they say they want a blog. Turns out after we talked through it, what they wanted was actually something pretty different. But they asked for a blog because that's sort of what they knew about, so it seemed like the logical thing to ask for. What they were really looking for was a way for prospective applicants to communicate with each other, maybe communicate with existing students so they could get a feel for what it was like to really come to the school. So we ended up building sort of a specialized discussion forum instead, something pretty different from a blog, because we felt, let's go through this validation process, find out what they really need, not necessarily just do what they're asking for. So that's sort of a happy example. Sort of a stickier example, which you run into often working with clients in a contracting relationship, is they may be very particular about, don't do it this way. I want you to do it that way. And that's potentially fine, but it's always important to have conversation about it, to ask the question why, to validate the assumptions that they're making, or assumptions that they're not even aware they're making about what they're trying to accomplish. So to give you an example, a client we've worked with at PromptWorks had an application for measuring the return on investment for retrofitting buildings to make them more energy efficient. So they had to be able to calculate what will the savings be if we put in insulation or replace the light bulbs and so forth. And they had a model for doing that. But the model was kind of weak. It didn't always work out. So they came with a list of, change these assumptions, change those assumptions, redo the model. So we said, okay, that's potentially a good solution, but let's step back and look at the bigger picture. What else could we do here? So what we ended up doing was a statistical sort of regression approach instead. Rather than making assumptions about what would make the model better, we actually measured our variables independently to see which ones were having effects, and did it really validate it against data rather than just making assumptions. This is another example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. So to pull this even a little further, let's start tying it to the contract process. When you look at a traditional fixed scope, fixed price contract, there's a real subtext to it culturally, that it's really implying sort of a typical Western style hierarchical relationship with your client. So what do I mean by that exactly? You're all probably familiar with this. This is what they call the project management iron triangle. That any project, there's a schedule and a scope and a cost. And when you're working with a client in a sort of fixed scope and price situation, they have a natural motivation to try to squeeze all three sides of this if they can. To get the scope, all the features that they want to build, the price and the schedule, all written into the contract, if they can. And you as a contractor, you're in the situation of, at the beginning, trying to estimate all these things. How long will it take? How much will it cost? Have we captured all the requirements in great detail? So at the beginning of the project is the time when you know the least about what you're actually going to be building. And that's the time when you're given this very narrow window to exercise your judgment about the scope and costs. And then after that, the door sort of closes, and now the risk and responsibility of the project is placed on you as a contractor. So this is not really a relationship of equal partners. And often what happens when you go down this road with these kinds of contracts, things almost always start to go wrong partway through the project. And when that happens, you don't want to end up like this guy. So you don't want to go that route. Instead, you want to take an Agile approach. Maybe you're an Agile Jedi, and you know the Agile Manifesto values collaboration over contract negotiation. Your potential client has not worked in an Agile way before. You'll talk to them about adapting to change and working in short sprint cycles to deliver functioning features and velocity to track progress and all this great stuff. And it all sounds really good to them, but it's not really enough. Even if your potential client likes what you're saying, you're asking them to take a leap of faith into something they don't really fully understand yet because they haven't experienced it. So it sounds risky. And they don't like risk, and their lawyers really don't like risk. So you need to explain the benefits of taking an Agile approach and not using a fixed price and scope contract. You need to do that in a concrete way that they'll find persuasive. So a good way to start is to take a close look at the assumptions that go into fixed price and scope contracts. Clients initially typically have an initial preference for these kind of contracts because they spell out what's going to be delivered, when, for how much, and at first glance seems to protect them from risk and put the risk on you, so they have a natural preference to work that way. So a good starting point is to highlight some of the misplaced assumptions and expectations your clients may have about how these contracts actually play out. So one assumption that goes into these types of contracts is sort of a waterfall style development process, where software development is treated really like a construction project. So there are some assumptions in there. One is long lead times, that there's going to be a long delay between the start of the project and the delivery of a useful product. That there's also limited opportunity for feedback. That feedback is only possible late in the project, if it's possible at all, and cannot play a large role in shaping the deliverables. Also, typically payments are made only when major milestones are achieved. And this situation of sort of infrequent large payments can raise the pressure and anxiety for both parties around these milestones. Also, an assumption that goes into this is if the contract is terminated early for some reason, say it was planned for 12 months, but we stop at 8, that can only mean that something went disastrously wrong. So all of those assumptions are invalid in an Agile project, because when we work in an Agile way, we're assuming a more highly variable research and development kind of approach. And one of the key things we do in an Agile approach is frequent delivery of working software, that we're working iteratively and incrementally, and we want to be able to provide software at regular intervals, which means the customer can realize value at regular intervals. So we may even say, hey, we want to launch early. Sure, we'll go live with the public in 6 months, but let's, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, get this in front of your internal users, get people actually using the parts that we've built so far, get that early feedback, make sure we're building the right thing. So they can start realizing value quickly with an Agile approach. It also means the contractor can get paid at regular intervals, so it can remove a lot of the tension that can build up around like these big and frequent payments. Instead, you can make smaller payments at regular intervals. And when you have this frequent delivery of working software, you're mitigating the risk and liability for both parties. So instead of 6 months, 12 months into a project, you're now wheeling out this sort of big thing that maybe only 2 or 3 people in a room have seen, and now you're going to launch it for everybody. That's really risky. So if instead we're working in small pieces, starting with some alpha users and some beta users, building up the project, we can really mitigate a lot of the risk and liability concerns with an Agile approach. So everything I just said, there's a couple assumptions here that are actually pretty important. One is that you as a contractor have a mature and disciplined development process, that you can actually do this. You can deliver working software on a regular, frequent schedule. Software that's complete, tested, that has complete and tested features. The other assumption is that you have a client who will work with you in an Agile way, which means they are strongly engaged in the project throughout its life cycle. Many people who are used to the more waterfall style, they're often used to the approach of being intensely involved at the beginning, and then they just kind of disappear for a while. So it's important that if you're trying to sell this approach, you make it really clear there's work for the client to be doing here too on an ongoing basis. Another key point is that adapting to change also decreases risk. When you have that ongoing opportunities for feedback, you can make adjustments. Maybe the market's changing, maybe there were some assumptions that were wrong about the project. You can adapt quickly and decrease the overall risk of the project. Whereas with the traditional fixed price and scope approach, that obligates the delivery of the original set of requirements, and requests for change only add time and costs or a lengthy renegotiation process. So when you start looking at it that way, when you've got something to compare it to, you can now say that the fixed price and scope contracts actually increase the risk and costs. And a key reason for that is the lack of frequent feedback, which we saw in the Agile approach. A lot of the points I just made here come from an article you can get online called the Agile Contracts Primer, and they have this wonderful little footnote in there where they talk about an outsourcing company in India that had learned to game the system, fixed price and scope contracts. Everything I've described so far makes it sound like the traditional fixed price and scope contracts put the risk on the contractor. But this company in India, which they don't name, basically took a very cynical approach and managed to flip the risk around to the customer rather than themselves. They knew from experience that the contract's initial requirements, all spelled out in great detail, they knew that that would not end up in the end meeting the customer's actual needs. So they looked forward to what they called the ongoing rent of change requests that would come after the initial contract was complete, because that initial contract obligated them to deliver the original system, even though in the end it would typically turn out to be unsatisfactory because the customers were learning as they saw it. Oh, what we said we wanted turns out not to be what we really need now that we're getting experience with using it. That's sort of a good war story that can be shared. So this slide here is the money slide, slide 35. This is your takeaway from the talk here. An Agile contract is more an agreement about a collaboration process and less about deliverables. When you're working with the fixed price and scope contracts, they can encourage sort of an adversarial mindset. They require big design up front, which means the particulars need to be negotiated in detail up front, and this pushes worry about risk to the forefront and who is bearing that risk. When you take the Agile approach, you're instead focusing on having an agreement about how we will work together to deliver a successful project. And this can get us much closer to the Omanatashi kind of relationship that I was talking about in the beginning. So let's step through this process a little bit with contract documents that are involved. So what goes into what I'm calling an Agile contract. There's typically 3 documents involved. First is the project proposal. It basically makes the case for why the client should choose you, describes the project at a high level. If the client likes the proposal, you can move on to the master services agreement and the scope of work documents. Master services agreement is what you think of as the legalese document that talks about liability and warranty and things like that. The scope of work is the agreement describing the actual work of the project. So let's step through these 3 documents a bit. Project proposal. These are the sections that we have in ours. I'm not going to step through each one because you'd all start nodding off if I did that. Our project proposals are typically 10 or 11 pages long. Some key things to highlight in this list. First, of course, is we make the case for why they should hire us at PromptWorks. We talk about our depth and breadth of experience, the quality of our work, and our technical practices. And of course, we tell them about all our other awesome clients. And we make the case for an Agile approach, including emphasizing the importance, like I mentioned before, of their being strongly engaged in the project throughout its life cycle. We also do something that's very valuable, we think, for the clients, which is we highlight the risks that we see in the project. Things that could affect the quality, the timeliness, or the cost of the project based on sort of their initial description of the project to us. The deliverables section, which in a fixed scope contract would be very long, ours is actually very short. We basically say we're delivering source code, we're delivering automated tests, we maybe talk a bit about browser compatibility, and we'll talk about a deployment process if it's a typical sort of Heroku or AWS kind of project. And that's really all we say about deliverables in the proposal. And then, of course, we talk about sort of the billing and business side of it, and we propose a time and materials approach. If you want to learn more about different kinds of contracts, there's another good article online by Peter Stevens, and he steps through all these different kinds of projects and talks about how different ones work well with an Agile approach and which ones don't. For the purpose of this talk, I'm really just going to focus on time and materials because that's what we have experience with. So it's time and materials with variable scope, and sometimes we will also include a cost ceiling in the project. We use time and materials contracts because they're pretty simple, they're easy to understand, they're easy to bill, and they provide the flexibility needed for running an Agile project. At PromptWorks, we've signed over 30 time and materials projects in the 2 years we've been in business. So what goes into our time and materials approach? First, we try to do a ballpark estimate based on the initial requirements. So client may have some documentation already, or maybe we'll just have a conversation with them, get sort of that big picture of the project. Again, not sort of the fixed scope approach of spelling out every little detail, but just what is the big picture of this project. So we try to give some, because even if you're working in an Agile way that's doesn't have a specified end date or specified number of hours, your clients, you've got to provide some sense of scope and scale, so they know what they're getting into. If you're doing an estimate for a small project, at least our experience with this, so we can really do those typically in a couple hours. If it's a bigger project, we'll probably spend a day or possibly more on it. We always involve at least 2 people in estimating. It's important to get multiple perspectives on the project. People bring different kinds of experience. Someone may notice something you're not noticing. You want to try to cover any big gaps that might be there in your estimate. And sometimes we'll do some back and forth with the client. We'll give an estimate, we'll talk a little more, they'll have some more ideas. So sometimes there's a second round of estimating if that initial project scope information turns out to be insufficient. We'll do an initial prioritization of the features if that's not already provided, because again, it's very important with an Agile approach. You want to build the most important things first. We also give our clients a dedicated team. This is really good for everybody. For the developers, it minimizes that cost of task switching. You don't want people jumping between multiple projects and losing focus and wasting time having to go back and forth. So it improves efficiency in that respect. Also helps give the team a real sense of ownership, that this is their client, this is their project, they really want to work together to do a good job. It also makes the billing a lot easier. We can bill in developer weeks. We're not having necessarily track, oh, someone spent 20% of their time on this and 20% of their time on that. It's very clear where they're spending their time. And we deliver working features weekly. We work in weekly sprints, and every week we'll have our clients in to demo, this is what we built this week, and get their feedback and look at the next round of priorities. So I mentioned the billing already. So we're working continuously also as part of this with our clients to evolve and prioritize features. Every time we do our demo, then we usually follow that with another meeting to talk about what's our next round of priorities. Do we need to change any of the feature requirements? And we stop when it makes sense. So unlike the fixed scope project where this idea of ending early means something's gone wrong, it could actually be a good thing for us and our clients. They get their key features in place and maybe they're satisfied at that point, and we can stop. So we propose all this. So for those clients where we actually get to the point of writing a proposal, about half of them raise concerns about everything I just described. And the key questions that they come back with are, how do I know we'll stay on budget? And how do I know we'll stay on schedule? These are trust and confidence kinds of questions. And building trust is key to an Agile approach. If you don't succeed in building trust, it's not going to bode well for the project, regardless of the type of contract. So what are our responses to these questions? Good one is providing references. You want your client to have some confidence in you. They don't know you. Great way to start building that confidence is give them references to people who have worked with you before and let them talk to them and share their experience about how great it is to work with you. You can reiterate the Agile advantages. We outline them in our document, our project proposal document. We'll talk with the clients about it. Sometimes we need to, especially if they're not familiar with the Agile process, often it's very helpful to just kind of step through some of the key points again, so they understand why it's helpful for everyone. In cases where budget is really a concern, we can include a not to exceed clause. This is something you have to explain very carefully if you put it in the contract, because it's not transitioning this into a fixed scope project. It's not guaranteeing features A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, for this budget. It's basically saying we will work in our Agile way up to this budget. We will not bill you beyond this price. That's really all we're saying when we include a not to exceed clause. Sometimes clients want that because they have a fixed budget and they just have to stop at that point. Or for them, it might be sort of a milestone kind of thing where we say, okay, we're willing to spend this much on your crazy Agile idea. And once we're there, let's check in and see how we're doing. And then we'll see if we want to keep going. Another thing we include is the client can cancel at any time, 30 days notice. So they are not obligated to us for months and months and months. They can cancel at any time if they're unhappy. And sort of coupled with that is that we write our code in a test-driven development way. We have automated tests for everything that we write. So if for any reason they're unhappy, not only can they cancel, but they can take that code and bring it to another contractor who could continue the project if they wish. So they have that ownership. So even after all that, of the clients that get to the proposal stage, we still lose about a quarter. People who just aren't comfortable working this way. And that's okay. So just to give you an example, this is an email from a prospective client we had that decided not to pursue the project with us. This is to Greg, one of our co-founders. They said, I really appreciate your interest in the project and the time you and your team put into the proposals, but the projected costs and open-ended structure just don't work for this project. I'll certainly keep PromptWorks in mind for the future, particularly if we get a project that would benefit more from the cooperative/iterative design process that you proposed. So they didn't want to go for it. And there can be several reasons for this. Sometimes price is too high. He just mentioned price, so maybe we're just too expensive for them, and that's okay. Sometimes we just can't win them over on the Agile approach. And here he's saying that he didn't think it fit the project. From our perspective, it did. It was a project that involved tying together different sort of legacy systems and writing some new code. There was a lot of potential for sort of discovery in there as you went and trying to learn how all these pieces fit together. So from our perspective, it did look like a good fit. So there can be multiple things sort of going on here. Some who are used to working in the sort of fixed scope and price way, some actually may just prefer the lower level of day-to-day client engagement that goes with, often goes with those kinds of contracts. And some just remain very attached to the feeling of security and familiarity with the fixed price and scope contracts. Or there are often cases where maybe they like everything that we're saying, but if they're in a large, complex organization, they may simply face insurmountable bureaucratic obstacles to accepting a time and materials contract. So that's the proposal. Master Services Agreement. We have one that we provide. Sometimes we'll also, clients will have theirs, they prefer we use theirs. So this can go sort of either way, who provides this Master Services Agreement document. This is the legalese document, all the legal language, so we worked with a lawyer to put ours together. These are the sections of our MSA. Again, I'm not going to step through every one of them, but let me point out some highlights. One is code ownership. This is something that is really important, for your client in their role. This can be an educational process that they own this code. We've had clients come to us who had a relationship, fall apart with a previous developer they were working with, and they would tell us, the developer built it, the relationship sort of fell apart, and the developer walked away with the code. Because they didn't know that they should own the code, that the client should own the code, not the developer. So we make a point of educating our clients that this is theirs, it's not ours, and they get to own it. Open source aspects often raise concerns, especially with clients who are unfamiliar with what that means, open source. At the beginning of the keynote yesterday, they mentioned 10 years ago at Philly ETE here, the keynote talk at that time was about licensing and all these concerns about open source. And over time, those concerns have generally fallen away. But for clients who aren't in the technology space, they may not really understand what it means to have this open source software. You're saying, you didn't write it, you're not going to warranty it. So it's often just an educational process of stepping clients through, how successful open source software is and how common it is to use it, and the advantages, especially for them in terms of cost, for these components we can get open source. Like I mentioned before, there's the option to cancel with 30 days notice, so that goes into the Master Services Agreement. Either party can cancel. For our services, this section is really short. Again, we are providing software development. We don't spell out all the details of the deliverables. If you are asked to sign an MSA that comes from your client, read it very carefully and beware of extreme requirements that can be in there. To give you just an example, we had one prospective client provide an MSA and it had this most favored nation clause in there. And most favored nation clause says that if we ever offer a lower price to someone else, we have to give them the same price. And that by itself isn't so bad, but there's one on beyond that. It said not only do we need to match that lower price for them, but that we would have to retroactively refund them for the entire cost difference on the project up to that point. So look out for things like these that can be in these documents. Scope of work. The thing to keep in mind here is keep it simple. I will show you an example of ours. This is actually, for a typical project for us, the entire scope of work minus the signature section that goes at the bottom. So the top section is just talking about the start date, who we are and who the client is, general description of the services, and we're basically saying we will provide, X number of people, how many developers are going to be working on this project, because we work in these dedicated teams, and we're going to provide software development and consulting services. We don't spell out the whole project. We just spell out a little bit in the deliverable section. This was for some code changes to an existing project. So it basically just says we'll be making code changes to features. And that we will provide unit and integration tests for the functionality. We outline the price, and then for timeline, we say when we'll start. We'll continue until the features are complete. And then we do try to say, given what's been communicated to us, we think it will take up to 4 weeks. And then another key thing is that we want a dedicated person on our client side to work with us. We don't want to be in a situation where there's 20 different people coming at us from the client's organization, all with different ideas about what the project should be. We want a dedicated point of contact. So, bring this back to my original point about the Omo-Tanashi kind of relationship. In our project proposals, we observe that the traditional big design upfront contract sets the developer and client at odds, as each tries to bend the ambiguity in the contractually specified features to their advantage. Because often, there'll be gaps in the requirements, there'll be vague language. If the big design estimate is too low, the developer can only absorb so much of that risk before they'll ultimately want to call it quits. So that's not what we want. We want to be our client's partner over the long term. We've learned the best way to align our interests and succeed together is to charge on a time and materials basis and cooperatively manage the risks inherent in all software projects. What we bring in our role as the contractors is our expertise in software development and agile practices, and we work together with our clients who bring their domain expertise, their business requirements, and their priorities. And we work to respect each other's roles, and together we do great things. So, owari, that means the end. Any questions? Yes?
Talk. What do you do, if anything, about escape clauses in terms of working with customers who sign on to Agile and then go off and disappear for months or years on end?
Well, two things. I guess one is to try to get them to not do that.
Sometimes they don't want to do that.
To be as persuasive as possible, to explain the costs of the project of them coming at it that way. And if we ultimately can't do that, we have a cancellation option. They can cancel on 30 days notice. We can also cancel on 30 days notice. And the Master Services Agreement has a section on cooperation, which is sort of warm and fuzzy, but it basically sort of outlines we're expected to have this close working relationship and really cooperate with each other. So if they're not living up to that, we do have grounds for ending it early, because often it's just, at the end of the day, can not be worth the time and the trouble if they're really just totally AWOL.
Right, thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have any experience structuring Agile-based bonus contracts? Something to the effect of, maybe you certainly can't work fixed cost, but in Agile there's this notion of greater value through greater velocity. Mm-hmm. And the idea of if you complete early or if you deliver value earlier than the customer expects, you get bonused or rewarded on it.
Right. I have not done that personally. I've read about it. The Peter Stevens article I mentioned talks about some of that, and some of there can be sort of cross pressures there. He talks more about, I think, well, actually bonuses and penalties both can create sort of perverse incentives to game the system, to do things to drive up your velocity number, even if it's not a genuine thing. So there are some risks around that, but I'm really going by what I've read, not from personal experience.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you guys exclusively do time and materials, or do you do any other pricing strategies?
In the time I've been with PromptWorks, which is about a year, it's all been time and materials. We have a co-founder here. Greg, would you have anything to add to that? Okay.
So never like the set a metric will, for search engine optimization say, hey, we want to share. And I don't know if you ever did anything like that.
Do you mean sort of a...
Here's a real metric that we established for the business value.
Oh, okay.
Give us 10% of the profitability.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
I have not done that. Greg's shaking his head. No.
I'm interested in the in when you're including the cost ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
What percent of time have you included that cost ceiling, and then when you have, what percent of time have you actually run to that cost ceiling?
Yeah. I'm not sure the numbers off the top of my head. Greg, could you answer that one?
Yeah, roughly maybe a quarter of the time we include that cost ceiling, and most of the time we did. I think because most of the clients we've asked for are planning rolling out in phases, so they expect us to do it. And often there are larger companies who put those in there to reflect the amount that, say, a PO that they want to organization is. They can't go over it on this SOW.
I guess one more follow-up question then is, how often have you run into that cost ceiling and not had a minimally viable product to roll out at that cost ceiling? Okay. Okay. Thank you.
A couple more.
Quick question on discovery.
Yeah.
You didn't really talk about it. I know for me, I'm a developer, and a lot of times I'm pulled in by the salesperson, and he gives me like 2 days to kind of evaluate this project and to give them that estimate for the contract for how long we'll do this agile process. And for me, like the estimate I give him is practically worthless because I haven't had enough time to really understand the problem of the app. And then the problem for him, I feel like, is, this company has given an RFP to like 6 agencies, and they expect a request, an actual proposal, not let's do discovery for 3 weeks or a month or 2 months or whatever. Do you have any feedback on that?
Just that it's a really hard problem. There's no easy answer to it. I think people who are used to doing the fixed scope approach, they're used to padding and say, well, based on what I see, it's going to be X, I'll multiply it by 3, and just sort of hope that it works out. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that one. I think it comes back to, I mentioned Bob Martin at the beginning of like, if you don't know, you don't know. And there can be these pressures to give a number, for the sake of the business needs to know. And I think there are ways to break that down. There's sort of a no estimates movement out there, which I personally don't find compelling. But there are parts of it that are. So you can, for something that's like a new project, you can look at things like, well, based on old projects, if you're really good at sizing your stories, and they have sort of consistent point numbers, you can start throwing the point numbers away and just sort of start saying, oh, well, we deliver 10 stories a week or whatever your velocity is. That can really help with the newer type projects. But when you're talking about sort of more what you're describing of like there's some existing thing that you have to understand, that can be harder with the legacy system because you don't know where the where the mine's in the minefield. You don't know what you don't know.
I have a lot of empathy for the client too. Like one of the stories I always try to tell is like, so I brought in a plumber to redesign my bathroom, and he wants to work agile. Like I would never allow that. But it's again, I guess, the responsibility of the plumber to sell me on like that process. But anyway, thank you. Good talk.
Thanks. Sure.
I guess I have a kind of a follow-up question to that estimation difficulty, because you guys do, it seems like, give rough ideas of how long you think something will take. So I think it's, in software it's definitely possible, although hopefully not common. You get a couple layers deep and you discover something and you can be off by as much as an order of magnitude.
Yes.
We thought this was going to take a month, it's going to take 10 months.
Right.
So how do clients react when things like that come up, and how do you handle that? I mean, how has that gone with these type of contracts?
The key thing there, and I think one of the things that makes an Agile process work so well, is transparency. That you're starting at the beginning saying, based on what we know, like you have given us this information, we can use this to estimate. And then if you are having this relationship with your client of working closely together and going through it, and you get into a situation where often it's on the business, sometimes it's the business side, sometimes it's the technical side, where these undiscovered things pop up or new requirements emerge. If they're closely engaged with you in that whole process, it's not this thing that's sort of coming out of the blue of like, oh my gosh, now it's going to be another 3 months. They're right there with you learning and saying, oh, we've looked at it, now we need these other requirements. Now the project's going to grow. But they are working hand in glove with you on that. Doesn't mean they're always happy, of course, when you tell something's going to cost more and take longer. But having them with you, working closely, building that trust in the relationship, I think is really key to getting through those difficult kind of situations.
Thanks.
Sure.
Do you guys have any recommendations or success stories about documenting project knowledge? Like, I find that it's very hard sometimes during the middle of a project to like have to substitute one developer for another, and because there's all this tribal knowledge about what has gone on, and I'm just kind of curious as to if you've worked to try to solve that.
A really key aspect for that is the tests. The tests are, they're written well and you have good test coverage. They are the documentation of the project. I've had some experience with that, coming into a project that's, been underway with the team, and I'm the new person having to figure all this out. And I guess it sort of depends if the people who built it are there. You've got someone who can mentor you. You can pair program, you can learn, you can start to acquire what you call the tribal knowledge. If you're on your own, that's harder. But if you've got the tests, you've got something to lean on. And I can't advocate enough the value of those tests where, you change one line of code. This is harmless, no problem. And then you run your test and 30 things broke, go.
I like that. That's interesting because I can imagine having a conversation with the client about some specific behavior, and even if you're not ready to solve that behavior, but just write a pending test, just like eventually, this scenario is going to happen and this should happen. And like it's just like, okay, conversation happened. This was the result of it. That's interesting.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow.
I just think it's interesting. Like it's an interesting idea to document client conversations as pending tests.
Oh yeah.
Like it's
Yes.
just occurred to me. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, especially the feature tests that outline, what the user experience is going to be.
That might be a good place to capture those things for future requirements instead of having a bunch of failing tests in your test suite.
On the subject of documentation, in your list of deliverables, there wasn't anything about delivering documentation. You talked about delivering code and delivering tests.
Right.
But is there anything about delivering documentation of what you've done? It would seem important, especially if the client owns the code at the end, that they would know how it worked from a larger design scale, architectural design type scale.
Right. So for projects where we're working with the clients, or rather we're going to deliver code that they're going to maintain, we want them involved in the building if at all possible. So they are part of that creation process and have that hands-on experience. And the projects I've worked on so far at PromptWorks, the deliverables have been the code and the automated tests and the user stories in the tracking system. But I can see what you're getting at, that there can be type of projects where you need more than that. Greg, can you speak to that at all from other projects we've done?
One project that we've do have minimal we need developers.
When you're talking to people, when you're trying to describe how it works to people who are not developers, who are not going to be running tests to see how it works, that's where it becomes important, I guess.
Yeah, I think that might be a different job. Maybe not a job in software. People who are not engineers. We don't usually solve that.
All right. Thank you very much. Oh, there's one more. Sorry.
Do you always deliver at the end of the first week? Because if you have a bigger project,
I'm sorry?
do you always deliver at the end of the first week? If you have a bigger project, you might need some time to build some foundation, right?
Yeah, we usually try for, that first week is always an interesting case. And we'll usually try for something that can be visible. Often a place to start is a homepage or the login system, the beginnings of a login system, that there's something to be seen. May not be a core feature, but at the beginning, from the technical point of view, that first week, maybe you can't actually deliver the most important feature of the system. You've got to get some basic infrastructure in place, and that's usually something like a login system or just some basic templating. So you have something you can start building those features on top of.
So you try to give them something, even if it's simple.
Yep. All right. Thanks very much.